Hello everyone, today we talk about military medicine, the assistance in general to men and animals at the same time on the fields of essentially modern Europe, but in part also addressing certain issues of medieval times, including the treatise production on such topics. It's a bit of a complex reflection. We will naturally speak more of that. This is actually the first time we do, I think, at least for as far as the physical care is concerned. We made a video about the moral health, let's say, at least from a very philosophical point of view, which reading from Erasmus, from other, if you want, ideal thinkers. Today we talk about a bit more concrete things, but without getting excessively into the detail, the technicality at least. So, as you know, this is the moment in Western warfare in which a big deal starts happening in terms of organization of the armies, of the improvement of the coordination of the troops and their supplying systems in parallel with the centralization of state and so on. Logistics was implemented importantly this time as well. Armies became larger, right, and more costly, and needing more material in proportion to the number of men. So a particular aspect of the logistics service was constituted by the moral and spiritual, as well as the physical and therapeutic assistance to the soldiers. Remember always the Renaissance thing we spoke yesterday too about of the moral and the physical health being all one, which is actually true from a scientific point of view. Well, we allude here, broadly speaking, to, on the one hand, to the Militärseelsorge, that is, to the chaplains, for example, and on the other hand, to the medical, nursing, and hospital service. Both have a fairly recent origin, as a formalized structure, although scattered elements can be found up to the 16th century or even earlier in time. And the care of the wounded in the field was generally summary and superficial, as was logical, you can imagine, given the haste, the discomfort, and above all, the poverty of both means and specific knowledge, right? Let's be honest, medicine sucked pretty badly for modern standards at the time. Yet these guys knew how to do what was in their capacity, and they limited themselves to cautery and some elements of traumatic surgery, a branch that, telling the truth, was quite developed since antiquity and the Middle Ages. Think of Galen's famous treatise on bandages, but I mean, we're talking about very mechanical problems. I mean, think about orthopedy, right, or even prostheses. Things those were something we can't find from very, very long time ago, right? Because after all, it's mechanic, and these people knew how to do it pretty well, right? In fact, let's say that in spite of the seriousness of the traumas, of course, they actually also, in terms of modern standards, these people this time knew how to do the thing, right? Substantially and pretty damn well, with capacities that we do not know from a practical point of view, but we know they worked, right? So these fields were actually pretty advanced, even in comparison to ours. And until the Middle Ages, the common soldier, if he fell into the hands of the enemy, had little hope of being cured institutionally, let's say, as it is now, or should be now, but of course exceptions exist everywhere today too. Apart from the network that compensated the thing of Christian charity, right, in the sensitivity of which the prisoner was equated with the poor, in the mentality of the time, to the beggar that had to be, had ruined fundamentally, so had to be shown mercy. Naturally, there were many reasons for which this could have. Prisoners sometimes were executed, tortured, taken out in most horrifying ways. But sometimes they were spared, and we're talking not just about those who could be ransomed, but sometimes also others for reasons that are, at the end of the day, as we know from a military point of view, essentially political, right? We could make many examples. I encountered some, I don't know, there was some, the reason, for example, when there were many mercenaries around, to also show off in front of them, but to be merciful, so that in case we would fight against them, not just the same ones you would let go, but after maybe having stripped them of horses and maybe not of arms even. But it depends. They would think they're, I don't know, they're connationals, if these were foreigners, as it often happened. That after all, they could expect mercy for you if you surrendered on the field. So these are all reasons that can bring to that. But there was a minimal assistance given also on a religious base, yes, for the spiritual sensitivity of the time. And naturally, the speech to be made for the nobles was different, who altogether brought their own doctors with them, right? And who, if captured, were chivalrously assisted. Naturally, this also meant, of course, this was because a prisoner of rank was a good capital for the ransom that he had to pay, while if he had died, nobody would have paid a penny for him, right? There are certain battle accounts, or better, certain French accounts I've read about the Battle of Pavia that written by servants that were trying to basically just take back home the corpses of their own masters that had been, killed in battle, and that was something horrible. Just in the way, that these dead were completely abandoned in a way, even if they were noblemen. Naturally, there are examples of peasants, I don't know, massacring happily noblemen at that point, but that, once again, it's a political matter, but it was always a risk. So also the myth that everybody was ransomed as long as it was noble, it's not really the truth, and still this doesn't speak for the actual risk that these people underwent constantly in combat, right? They might have been better armed, but armored, protected in that sense, but that doesn't mean actually that the thing was less risky, because that was exactly some of the not just the best protection, but some of the best, the most offensive means. And here we're talking naturally also in times of pikes of non-necessarily noblemen, because speaking of the tercio, for example, there were actually two, but I mean, most of the time thinking about the landsknechts, there surely weren't noblemen in a sense we intend, but also arquebusiers, firearms that do not look at who you are, right? But a real, speaking of the Spanish, speaking of the tercio, a real medical service may begin to emerge exactly with the Spanish tercio, which admitted, however, this gives you the proportion of the thing, 1 doctor for every 1,000 soldiers, which, yeah, I mean, as we've seen, medicine was fairly limited in effectiveness at the time, but still one doctor or 1,000 men, that, as we have seen, and we will see also better now, didn't die just of wounds. Actually, that was the minority amount of death. Most of these people died, of course, of illness, and usually unrelated to sustained wounds. But that was still something. And we also never have to underestimate in this context what, in fact, practical medicine was actually about. We could open a huge parenthesis to see what, in fact, who doctors really were at the time, right? It's not that doctors normally were meant, especially in the civilian reality, not even to touch patients. You're a doctor, you don't touch patients, right? That's something for the barbers, for midwives, right? Who often actually had a much more practical understanding of health than doctors themselves. They were something a bit in between, alchemists, astronomists, but also naturally, of course, they had a medical understanding, but medicine was considered, as the figure of the doctor was concerned, something very different for social reasons now we can't discuss. However, as we also know, it's exactly from military medicine, from the horrors and the most devastating traumas that you can see in war, that medicine rocketed, historically speaking, at all times. And never underestimate in this sense also what the soldiers themselves actually knew about health. I mean, these fighters surely know how to dose their own psychophysical resources in ways that we have no idea in many ways. Think especially about, I don't know, knights still at one point. That's something that really functions in an empirical way, but still on with an actual benefit. So these people knew what they had to do. They saw their companions maimed, wounded, bleeding to death, exploding now with cannonballs and everything, but in the most, the goriest things you can imagine. So they had a pretty devastating understanding of what a human body works like when it underwent certain realities, and also from a psychological point of view. So these people did have a capacity even of curing themselves, very roughly as you understand, but still in ways that could be very effective and based on experience on the field. So it will be noted also that in the light of what we have just explained, that the Spanish soldiers were more interested in prostitutes than doctors, and this is quite understandable if you think about it. This opens also, in fact, to another thing, maybe we'll talk in a while, of how much soldiers were actually still assisted by civilians and sometimes by family, by their wives, their women. Speaking of prostitutes, well, sometimes it could be actually the same thing, because that's also how this man lived in a, you can't imagine what these people were, right? These were derelicts. They came from the scum of society, the French. So they started to make a living as professionals in ways that were extremely dangerous and extremely poor. On the video on the Spanish Rogue, we made, I think, a pretty interesting portrait of the sheer poverty that existed throughout all the military business, which was a business, it's always been for most of all these times, right? These people lived just a tiny bit better through the hope of looting and pay than they would have done in the normal conditions they would live in everyday life. So it's not that they were faring well or that they were well assisted and so on, but they made up a living through it. So they adapted also with their families, with the people who could assist them and so on. Also, speaking of the presence of doctors in these early modern armies, it must be said that in the same phase, neither the French nor the English knew the practice of doctors hired directly by the army, right? Which entails a centralization, someone, who pays for it. Of course, yeah, these were still mostly subcontracted units, but somebody paid. It could be a royal commission or something, but there wasn't a permanent organic of military, of medical personnel attached to the army yet, properly met, who was starting to appear, not even some of the major European armies, as you understand here. So the wounded was rescued as far as possible by experienced comrades and civilians, as we've seen, the latter being especially women. Here in the video, I've inserted some beautiful pictures from Landsknechten accompanied by their women, and that's quite interesting. Could be even a cultural thing actually in Germany, considering the bit more of the warlikeness of certain societies compared to other areas of Europe, and the fact that even women were committed. And I don't think that women wouldn't fight, right? This is definitely false, right? It doesn't maybe have to open to other broader structural guessings, because that was not the normality. But actually, you can imagine the toughness of these individuals, men and women, of course, the feelings, the relations that brought these people to simply live like that together in these extremely violent and horrifying realities, right? And as we all know, the armies were followed regularly by this figure of a subtler train by civilians, merchants that distributed the loot, sold both the provisions, prostitutes, simple mortiers. I mean, people just wanted to loot along with the army, right? And sometimes it would become the same soldiers at a point because it wasn't such a clearly defined boundary at that point. So in the mid-16th century, a certain progress was recorded in France, right? Thanks both to the Admiral Coligny, who tried to set up a fund for the establishment of military hospitals, and to a considerable medical interest that had developed around weapon wounds by fire. And on this subject, of course, we cannot but mention the famous work by Ambroise Paré, right, one of the greatest doctors of the modern era, published in 1545. It was the first of a consistent series. Paré, who had left in 1536 as a military surgeon for the campaigns of Italy, developed a new system in the treatment of wounds from arquebus, medicating them with ointments rather than burning them with hot iron or boiling oil. And it is from him, in fact, that the practice of cautery gradually lost ground, supplanted by more effective therapeutic methods, or with the same effectiveness, much less painful ones, say. And it is true that it has been noted that his méthode de tracter les plaies faite par arquebus et autres bâtons à feu, prescribing the ligation of the arteries before the amputation, is linked to a method already practiced by Fabrizio d'Acquapendente, but from the who was an important anatomist and who was experimenting altogether with many others in Europe, actually, these things. But from the point of view of military surgery, the writing of 1545 is a real military milestone on a path that was then beginning and would have led to remarkable results. Between the 16th and the 17th centuries, things had already changed, in fact. In England, for example, each company was provided with, among other things, a doctor and a chaplain. We have seen it in videos, for example, about the English army of the armies of the English Civil War. And the association of the two specialists will not seem strange to those who know, as we were saying before, the medieval and early modern European mentality for which health of the body and health of the soul are maintained and or recovered together, right? Which is also in fact pretty correct. And however, the rational organization of the great standing armies was necessary after the mid-17th century in order for military medicine to obtain the role it deserved, together with other things. Thinking about the scientific revolution, the objective improvements in modern medicine, and alongside them the military veterinary developed, right, which was important in armies that at that point had a lot of cavalry, again, many horses and mules used for transport too. And even in this perspective, after all, the veterinary had a great tradition already established in the medieval treatise of farrieries. So for the shoeing of horses, chiefly, but also of bovines, etc. That was known since, think about the pediatric manuals that date back actually to the ancient world, and that in the Middle Ages, especially with the importance that cavalry, and especially very heavy cavalry, had gained in armies, was developed further, by the way, across many cultures all over Europe and the Mediterranean and beyond, naturally. And considering this, that Europe, yes, had good cavalry, but there were countries where they were even more properly equestrian, and in cultures, to think about the steppes or right around her, the Mongols or Persia, etc. But the important here is that the presence of treatises speaks for an important amount of wealth invested now by the sedentary societies in cavalry in a way that is properly structural and entails actually continuous, intense use feudal Europe is fundamentally, even in that regard, an equestrian society, we could call it by other standards. The military doctor was not only important to treat wounds, right? It is true that the modest means offered by the medical science of the time were directed and proved effective above all in that direction. It is also true, however, that the many health problems of a medieval and early modern army were far from being exhausted in the wounded, as we were saying before. That, for example, hygiene was of primary importance for the armies, was already considered by a writing of the time of the crusade of Frederick II of Swabia, the De Regimine et Via Itineris et Fine Peregrinantium by Adam of Cremona, who posed that the hygiene problem of a Western army in a hot climate country like one of Syria, Palestine, right? And we talked about this in the videos about the Frankish military organization during the Crusades, and also a bit the prejudices existing about the alleged, cavalry, let's say, the question difficulties that the Crusaders faced, but these works actually display all the know-how and capability to cope pretty damn effectively, as was showed on the battlefields of the Near East, also of the Western. And think about all the broader range of even of cavalry employment on a long scale, the Cistercian specialization in horse breeding for, war horses specifically to be sent to the Crusades, the enormous resources, as was seen before, invested by feudalism altogether for the care of the horse, for horse breeding and so on, and horse training, right, for military purpose. So later, it became, we mentioned Frederick II among other things. He was also pretty keen on such topics, on natural philosophy altogether, not just the studying of horses he wrote about, but think about falcons, but the medieval man was extending his understanding to a global perspective, to a universal perspective, and think about the crossroad that even the Kingdom of Sicily at that point was between Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and so on, in all the accumulated knowledge and wisdoms and practice. Science at the time, was like 70% invention, but that 30% kind of worked, right? And this is astonishing on an empirical base, which is that they didn't properly know what's laid behind, but they knew what the effects were and they knew how to use them, which is astonishing. And this is knowledge that objectively we have lost in part, because we can definitely check with our modern means the effectiveness of certain remedies at a certain level, but we fail in realizing how they were capable with their own means of finding out, which is something that with our modern technology we do not have. And this is true at so many levels, even just about military technology. Today we have steels that, our engineering standards do not consider steel even the one that actually was, from a chemical point of view, in the Middle Ages, for how, low quality it is because of obvious reasons compared to our own times. But the ways those guys made those swords, with our military technology today, we are not capable of replicating it in terms of ergonomy, what that thing served for, right? Which doesn't mean that every sword they made was fine. Like for a very good sword, that were out of 9, were kind of like that. But at the same time, they knew what was the way, and that way we have lost, and that's why I think we should learn so much to be humble, first and foremost, when thinking about those times, what those people had to overcome, and the way that they managed. Because in their shoes, we would be totally plain, right? But speaking of the later times, it became increasingly clear that the soldiers' fearsome enemies were mostly parasites, dysentery, syphilis, contagious diseases in general, infections, right? That's what killed people, first and foremost. Many apparently insignificant wounds, especially in the cavalry units that lived in contact with their animals, could have been as many ways to open to tetanus, for example, and many things they didn't know, of course. So people died more from sustained and ill-treated wounds or from contracted diseases and their after effects than in battle proper. This is pretty well known. The cold, the humidity, the unhealthy food spread tuberculosis in the camps, and this is a reality that we have experienced up to very recent times. We went from mercenary armies, we passed to conscript armies, basically. Also, new problems arose. This time also of a psychological nature, and this is another very overlooked chapter that we often, as far as I've seen, I'm not an expert on the literature, the existing literature, but I think we have fixated excessively on the war trauma per se, like, not in combat, let's say for combat generally speaking, but this is actually a very complex topic that I also do not think absolutely to have the competence of addressing, but that I have some opinion, at least as far from the few things I have gained from reliable sources, that emerge actually from the same concerns arising at the time, right? Because, I don't know, naturally today we know what post-traumatic stress disorder is and how to cope with that, why it happens, and so on, which is something that became apparent after major wars that have left pretty mass-scale scars under that point of view. Think about shelling during World War I and all the consequences of it. The fact that still by World War II, medicine hadn't really quite understood, really quite taken into adequate consideration what these shocks properly were. For cultural reasons, I presume most of these realizations came out after the Vietnam War in the West. So we all know what we're talking about, and we have rightfully wondered whether this was a thing also in the past, in the far past as well. So the answer is not easy, because the single most important and at the same time is the least known factor, and objectifiably so, for answering this question, is the mindset of people. These are psychological disorders, right? Pretty serious ones, as you know. And the question is, you can hardly understand from a scientific point of view what this is, right? At the medical level, considering that most of the evidence we get this stuff from is from the same people we can talk to and assist today, right? We do not know what the mindset of a 15th century man-at-arms actually was, nor the one of a Germanic warrior of the Migration era or of a Hellenic hoplite of the 5th century BC. We have literally no idea. Like, we can't, I mean, we have no idea in the sense that we have a pretty good understanding of what the surroundings were in some ways, but of course we can't be in those people's heads. And this is very fascinating because we have actual accounts of all what seems to be like pretty intense disorders, post-traumatic nature, connected to combat not only, but albeit we're the same exact animals, we're the same exact, from a biological point of view, we're the same people. There's nothing that has changed, genetically speaking, from that time. We work in the same identical manner. The mental flexibility of a human brain is something so elastic that we have no idea whether how a mind of that time would react to that kind of violence the way we, in comparison to what we would now, right? Because people at the time were exposed to a pressure that since a very early age they were acquainted to, just in terms of mortality, of uncertainty, of risk, of violence, of abuse, and they would be pretty interesting subjects to psychoanalyze, right? One of the greatest dreams would be to psychoanalyze a 13th century European knight, because at that point we really would understand a lot of things that you wouldn't like to know, but it's perhaps the single most important thing. Also, the first reason why any kind of historical reconstruction that doesn't even take into consideration what the mindset aspect could be is by declaration nonsense, right? That's also a hint for all those who think that they can actually recreate what combat practically was at one point. And of course there are certain macro information we can get, but we have no idea how it was. Like it's just we can imagine it, but we do not have the actual evidence in terms of historical sources for drawing let's say an accurate depiction of that. So another thing we have deeply overlooked in all this is, in fact, not the kind of laboratory-like exposure of a average human being to a certain type of trauma, which doesn't make sense, but exactly what the context could be, and not just the one of where the trauma occurred, but specifically what that mind came from. Because without that, you can't properly understand it. You have to realize what these people lived like before they were sent to the meat grinder of a pike and shot warfare or whatever. So in this, history helps us, because the always diligent philosophe militaire, let's say, of the time, noticed how among the conscripts, so people that normally were not about war, they were peasant overwhelmingly, as all in pre-industrial society. It's not to say that peasant life is not hard, but it is hard in a specific way that is still different from the one of a veteran, right? And among these people, the nostalgia and the concern for the distant home and family took on sometimes the character of a real depressive crisis. Right, it was dangerous, of course, since the tendency to suicide is characteristic of the clinical picture of depression, first of all, and in battle, even a single unconscious seeking that by a soldier could have compromised the salvation of entire units. These are things that we pretty damn well know about today's military, as well as civilians that, as we have seen, are always mingled into these scenarios. So that is quite important, because rather than thinking about just the trauma of the exposure to the brutality of these pictures, there is to say, why would, the motivation, one of the single most important thing in there, especially in times where, as we know, there wasn't much of a standardized collective discipline, right? It was beginning just to be the case, so that today we know pretty damn well how to pick a person from, of course that can't be done literally with every person, but in conditions of emergency we know how to draw a person from a completely civilian background and to traumatize them at the point of transforming it in a killing machine. We absolutely know how to do it, and we do it pretty damn well, which is exactly what a soldier must be, because that's what, thankfully, soldiers are meant to be, without, of course, making them lose their humanity in something. But we know that there is a specifically mechanical requirement for them to behave like that, because human beings are not meant, contrarily wise to what some ideologues want to be, to actually kill each other, at least cold-bloodedly in the way the military teaches us to be. We need, in a certain sense, even to dehumanize not the soldier much, but specifically the actual target, right? Because normally human beings are not, when they see another human and they look at their eyes and in their fear, etc., they feel compassion. Even if they hate a person, they just want to humiliate them, to give them a lesson, to hurt them, yes, of course, but not to kill them, right? Instead, that's dangerous, because in war you cannot reason like that. It's dangerous for you, it's dangerous for others, and consequently for whoever is sacrificing for you to fight for them. So you cannot have mentally weak individuals, right? That's also why the psychological selection is crucial in the modern military, and in military professionals specifically, because it's a pretty horrible thing, right? Not everybody sustains that, and this happens at so many levels, right? It's psychological and physical at the same time. Physical trainings in the military are something astonishing, right? But we shouldn't think that what was the case at the time was something less, right? And I want to stress here the psychological side of the story, because the question that, people were tougher physically speaking, they were all super people at the time, and now we're not. It's not really true, right? A modern athlete of our times would be considered a god in the ancient world, still for our for their physical standards, right? But it's here where we seriously and deeply fail with what the mindset is, right? Human mind can do things that normally we can't even imagine. And those contexts brought so much pressure for these people to be useless to it, but still, of course, they were fragile people, or people that, on the norm, they were simply scared. They would break, because there is always a breaking point. Doesn't matter how tough, how trained, how experienced you can be. You can come from the elite of special force operators. You all have a breaking point, for which you, at a certain point in action, you will start freaking out and using your assault rifle as a club rather than what is meant for to be used. And because we're just big apes with a dramatically limited hardware, but actually an incredibly, at least potentially capable software. And that's where they knew where they would invest in. So naturally, this gradual, now we can't digress on the gradual effort to bring and the very complex topic of military discipline is something we have addressed here and there, actually, already made some videos on, but specifically we have to realize how difficult it was just to create a functional unit in the field at the time. Remember that collective training surpasses by far everything, right? You do not win battles because you have people who are courageous or strong. You win battles because you have units that work collectively, because they have trained, and especially because there is somebody who can lead them from above to keep control in this, in the midst of this overwhelming pressure that the one of a guy on the front line can't even understand. Right, the guy in the front line dies, but the pressure that a commander gets is something that the guy from the front line mostly cannot help, right? And that's why some would simply have the nerve-wracking chance of throwing themselves against a bayonet or a machine gun nest, and that will not make the war won, and on the contrary will quite likely actually endanger the broader scenario, and sometimes can actually endanger his own unit, and that's dramatically easy to achieve, right? That's something that I struggle to explain sometimes. That is, never think that a human being cannot. That for any person in the world it would be something impossible to be brought to that point that you can actually kill someone in the blink of an eye, or what I said before is specifically referred to the fact that the context very often doesn't give us the necessity to, but actually in specific conditions we can all transform ourselves into killers in less than 3 seconds. Because in our brain that's the trigger that is pulled by certain specific situations, and it's extremely easy to train people. Brutal. It's very easy. You just brutalize them, right? Of course, with the right measure, but that's also why, because human beings are fundamentally cowards, right? And they understand just at some point when they are beaten hard, and that's exactly what discipline is, and that's why it's a pretty damn serious and fascinating thing at the same time. But that has to do with a control that at that time these units sometimes didn't have, right? So while these new conscripts were being injected into the meat grinder, there was the realization that many of them were, at least they didn't have the nobody had paid enough for making them effective of what they had to be, and that's the difference between a conscript and a veteran, a military professional in general. Well, veteran can also, at that point, being spent and exhausted psychophysically, so that's not even being a veteran, being actually a discriminant. That can be a good trainer that would get at that point. But specifically, that's the difference between professionals and amateurs, right? And that's why also we made those videos reflecting, together with the military philosophers of this time, about the old custom of recruiting marginalized and vagabond people that were preferred in this sense because they at least did not suffer from nostalgia and did not oscillate between the two opposite extremes, characteristic of those who had something to lose, right? Modern armies were composed of literally of the worst scum you can ever imagine, right? There was nothing national about it. There was nothing. It was all about giving them something to live for because they didn't have anything else, so they didn't give a damn, right? Imagine you have no family, no property, no nothing, so just make war. It's a work like another, and maybe you're already, enough, mentally, because there are also certain specific, in fact, psychological profiles that do fit for war, in those ways that are specifically to do with taking care of your next in the unit, which is something fairly rare to find. There's nothing deterministic even in here, but we know, psychologically speaking, a certain, Victoria Cross recipients were either psychopaths or orphans that had to take care of their families since an early age, right? And those are still not all, however, that can work at a platoon level, but not necessarily at a higher levels of the organic, but still they do as meat grinding material, right? Because they are the ones who are on the field are going to literally kill their fellow man, and that's what they're meant for, to do something extremely, even heroic, even fanatic if you want, but still to get the job done. What most of the troops, actually even pretty good ones, wouldn't be able to, or at least not in the same way. That's also where the equivocal about the reinjection of the term warrior has come from, because people believe that actually to win wars you need warriors. Fortunately not, right? Because actually that is a long, this is just a relic of the past. But as far as the action gets simpler as to the individual, because that's what really is, and this is no disrespect by the slightest, but it is the truth of war. Well, you do need those specific people to get the material job done on the field, right? And of course, in strictly military terms, one commander is worth even millions of those people, and has consequently a much greater responsibility as an individual that goes far beyond what, the warriorhood that is not what you win modern wars like, but something much else that has mainly to do with intelligence, but not specifically just with but with very specific psychological requirements that we also discussed in the Kriege. But the fact that at the time, at least, these people were recognized as, vagabonds, outcasts, and so on, as good soldiery material. Well, that's pretty interesting, because it was actually true, right? And they didn't undergo particular despair. They had something between the unconscious relaxation and the instinct of conservation that wouldn't bring them to this excessive prudence bordering on cowardice, right? And or an element of indiscipline and disorder in the field. They would just live like that, and it would have been plausibly even better than what they would be normally exposed to in civilian lives. Many people also had were saved, we could say, albeit, actually the fate of veterans, we saw it pretty well in that video on the Dragonnade, the time of Louis XIV. Well, yet it's not that they had much of a future themselves. It was full of these relics after wars that nobody liked, and that's unfortunately something that didn't help. As we know, even their psychological traumas they would still get, in spite of their more higher or lower aptitude to war, from the horrifying things they experienced in war. Sometimes they perpetrated themselves, actually, in terms of senseless massacres of civilians. I mean, look at what the 30 Years' War was actually about, so you can imagine just how complex, from a psychological point of view, it is to deal with them. But this is exactly the problem. Some of them would be easier to cope with, as far as the military side was concerned. But this was a world of hell compared to our own standards, and we have pretty serious difficulties from a psychological point of view ourselves to understand. Because fortunately, or I can't say unfortunately, but there's something we have lost in the process. We are not like that anymore. So at least from an historical point of view, we have to cope with this realization and with this problem that really is one, in terms of how do we even start talking about a campaign or a battle if we don't take into consideration even just hypothetically what the mindset of these people could be, right? And this is the main problem I have in general with any kind of military historical reconstruction. That is, there is no positivistic, technologistic approach that can bring us to a satisfactory understanding of that war, because we have to accept as historians that that's our own limit, right? There are simply things we can approach, we can understand better, but we will never fully know, because we don't even fully know what we did today ourselves, if we had to recollect that, right? So you can imagine what was like in a battlefield 1,000 years ago. But anyhow, this is more or less what I wanted to talk about. I hope that you enjoyed it. Actually, I like very much these topics, and at the same time, though, I don't know enough, right? So I promise that at some point we will deepen these topics for the sake of exactly touching this vital issue that we have enormous difficulties to just discuss sometimes, even for moralistic reasons, for prudence. I don't even know what it is there, but for prejudices a bit about the same nature of war, and this need to demonize or to idolize from standpoints that history, the past and those same people wouldn't give a damn about, right? However, for now, just hope really that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.